Today we're going to make a cafe table out of 3/4 inch plywood. No CNC needed for this one. We're going to make all of our cuts with a circular saw and a jigsaw. Typically I use 3/4 inch plywood from big box retailers, but for this project I'm using a premium plywood from Columbia Forest Products. For my straight cuts I'm using my Kreg straight edge guide and my Ryobi Circular Saw. All the pieces that I need are coming out of this single 28-inch by 48-inch board. I made the design up as I went, just drawing the lines on the plywood itself directly, but I'll put a link in the description so that you can see my exact layout. I want curves at the corner, so I used a glass plate to create rounded connections between my angled lines. Jigsaws and their blades have gotten a lot better over the years, and it's actually not that hard to accurately follow lines. I cut right down the center of the line, and I just keep my eyes directly on the blade itself. This Ryobi Jigsaw pushes most of the dust away, but occasionally I just give it a little blow to clear the dust. For me, accuracy is all about where my eyes are, and I really like to hover over the blade itself and then just slowly guide it along that line. You can get pretty accurate results with this method. And sure, a CNC is a great thing to have, and I love designing projects in Illustrator and then just having them all cut out perfectly. But there's something really enjoyable about working through a design as you go. Plus, the kerf on the jigsaw is thin, so there's very little waste for this project. Look at how nicely all the pieces fit together. I really like asymmetrical designs, but I know that's not for everyone. So you could adjust this design so that the legs are bent in the middle, which would give you a more symmetrical tabletop. I used the plate method once again to round over the remaining sharp corners on the tabletop. Now because I cut the board to 28 inches wide, all of my legs were the exact same length. Now I can just clamp them together and use my orbital sander to remove any discrepancy between the four legs. I'm using these 1.5-inch wide strips to connect the legs to the tabletop. I cut the pieces to length using my circular saw, guided by my Kreg portable crosscut. I used a plastic container to draw curves on the ends, and then cut outside the line with my jigsaw. I went outside the line because I'm going to use my orbital sander to sand them all nice and flush. This Europly is a lot denser and stronger than typical plywood, so I started with 100 grit sanding pads and then worked my way up to 220. I'm going to need some little spacers also cut from the 1.5-inch wide strips. And since I'm doing this all with hand tools, I screwed these short pieces down so they could make the cuts safely. You don't need a palm router for this project, but it is a handy thing for getting consistent roundovers to all your plywood edges. If you don't have one, you can do this by hand using an orbital sander. I sanded all the pieces to 220 grit and was ready to start assembling. Let's start with the supports that connect the tabletop to the legs. I glued one of those little spacer pieces between the two supports. I then screwed through one of the longer supports to center the shorter ones right in the middle. I'm basically making a cruciform or cross-shaped structure that will sandwich the four legs. I put a little glue on the end of the legs, sandwiched them in between the supports, and then drove in 2 screws to hold them in place. The trick here is just to be clean with your glued up joints so that you reduce the amount of sanding that you have to do later. Even though this plywood is quite strong, these legs are too long to not have some sort of support between them. Aesthetically, I prefer the most minimal way to do this, and I think that's with these really thin strips that are glued together. If you're concerned about strength, you could cut some wider strips and use the jigsaw to cut notches in them to make another cruciform structure that sturdily anchors the legs right in the middle. This is a much more heavy-duty approach, but it also looks a little more heavy-duty. So I decided to go with the more low-profile option. I pushed them into the approximate location and then applied just a little bit of glue underneath them. Now all I have to do is push them down over the glue. It's helpful to have a damp rag nearby to remove the excess glue before it cures. After checking to make sure they were placed in a level orientation, pre-drilled some holes and drove in some screws. I'm using finished screws, and I also screwed these two supports together. I placed the tabletop upside down and then set the leg structure on top. I pre-drilled holes and used 2-inch long finished screws to connect the top to the legs. I covered up the screw heads using walnut colored wood putty, and once that had cured, sanded it nice and flush. I used clean microfiber rags to remove all of the wood dust, and then applied a really heavy coat of Maker brand Simple Finish. This is a plant-based oil and wax wood finish. It's super easy to apply, and it really brings out the rich colors of the walnut. After letting the finish sink in for about 10 minutes, I checked to see if there were any dry spots, touched up this first coat a little bit here and there, and then waited another 10 minutes before using a new clean rag to remove all of the excess and rub everything out. This walnut veneered Europly is a very premium project, and it's certainly not inexpensive. But every once in a while I like to use a higher end material when I figure out a design that really takes advantage of its strengths. And in this case, the strengths are literal. This plywood is denser and stronger than typical plywood, and so even though it costs more, you don't need to double up the legs like I would if I just used a typical pine construction plywood. I love plywood furniture. I've made so many pieces, some using a CNC, others doing by hand, and I don't really think it's like an either-or situation for me as the designer. I like doing both. So check out this playlist of all my plywood furniture projects, and let me know which ones you like the best in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and happy holidays. Bye.